Morning.
Morning, morning. Time I join it, it
Joined us for our session this morning. We will begin promptly at 10. So we ask that you stay online with us and we will begin shortly. Thank you. For those of you who are just joining us, we welcome you and we will begin in about 1 minute. Thank you. Good morning, colleagues. I am Sherry-Ann Farquharson, Knowledge Management and Capacity Development Expert for the Caribbean Center for Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency, CCREEE. Welcome to the IRRP Integrated Resource and Resilience Planning series of capacity building sessions brought to you by the CCREEE in partnership with the Technical Assistance Program for Sustainable Energy in the Caribbean, TAPSEC, funded by the German Corporation for International Cooperation, GIZ, the German government in partnership with the European Union. Planning for the future of the electricity sector requires an appreciation of the technical issues arising from grid expansion with renewable energy integration, as well as responding to demand side changes. And that is why we've designed this series of capacity building for the IRRP process so that our stakeholders may be more involved in this process as we go along. Today, we will be looking at basic demand projections. A few housekeeping matters. Your mics are muted, and so we invite you to pose your questions in the Q&A or in the chat, and we will acknowledge them and respond throughout the session. Today, our capacity building will be led by Professor Sharma and Dr. Bahadur Singh from the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine Campus Faculty of Engineering. We look forward to an interactive and productive session. I now hand over to Professor Sharma.
Good morning, everyone. I trust that most of us have kept safe and we are COVID-free. Firstly, I'd like to empathize with our colleagues from St. Vincent. There's no way you can plan or even forecast for a natural disaster like that. And my thoughts are with the people of St. Vincent. This morning, that's Dr. Bahadur Singh and myself, are going to do what I consider forecasting 101. So what our intention here really is to get you in tune in terms of the terminologies which are going to be used or which are used in forecasting for loads, energy loads, and with particular reference to power loads. And we hope that at the end of it, we would have whet your appetite for delving deeper into these topics. Just remember that it's an introductory presentation, and many of the terms might not sink in at first if you have never heard of it, or if you have heard of it, would be a refresher to give you what we consider as basic definitions in terms of the forecasting requirement. Of course, most of us in the end will end up be utilizing some type of forecasting software. So our objective really is for you to understand two things. One, what are the terminologies and their meaning? And two, what are the limitations of the mathematical routines which reside behind these programs to give you your estimate for what the future would look like? Firstly, is everyone seeing our screen?
Yes, Prof, you may go ahead. We can see.
Okay, so let's go ahead. These are the two presenters. The more distinguished one that you see there is me, and my colleague is on my left there, and he will take on after I've completed the first part, and we'll have a break at the first part. So I will start with some of the basic requirements in terms of our forecasting and set the whole show in motion. So in terms of what we are going to do would be a quick introduction. Then we're going to look at how you define your loads. Once we know how we define our loads, how are we going to do load forecasting, meaning how the loads are going to grow. And at times they're going to fall off depending on the elasticity of your customers that you have. What factors you need to consider when you're doing your planning, your demand projection techniques, and finally the closing remarks. And I presume at is at the end of those remarks that we will have our time for Q&A. Is that so, Sherry? Probably it is. So there are four questions that come to mind immediately in terms of this particular aspect. What is the probability of load growth? And we'll look in terms of a coin toss. What is the probability of a coin toss being heads or tails? Most of us have met that before. What is the probability that you will always get it correct? Why is the forecast different from actual? And why does the forecast fail to capture these features from the actual that is occurring? We know the first one is quite easy because there are only two choices. You can either get heads or tails. But what most people seem to miss is that this is a probability calculation. And 50% only comes about after you have done thousands of trials. So you can probably do 100 tossing and get all as heads. But that does not change the probability, okay? So what I'm saying there is that you can do a forecast, but if you have not projected very far into the future, or you don't have enough data in which to analyze your forecast, you can get it wrong. It doesn't mean that your data, your methodology is wrong. It just means the quantum of data that you had was not sufficient for the time frame that you wanted to do your estimation on. What's the probability you always get it correct? Well, 0%, because like I just said, you are going to get it wrong sometime. But you're hoping that the percentage that you're going to get it correct would be much higher than 50%. There are two other questions. Why is the forecast different from actual? And why does the forecast fail to capture the features from the actual? Now, the first one is not really a relevant question, but it's something that many times come to your mind. But the one that is really relevant is the last one, is why does the forecast fail to capture these features from actual? And that's what we are going to very quickly look at in this particular presentation, why you're not going to get the actual value that you're trying to forecast and what could be causing this issue. So in effect, what we are saying is that many decision-making processes today, they are difficult to capture in a probabilistic form. So we can do the mathematics, but it does not mean that the mathematics will give you 100% correct answer in terms of once you know the answer. Hindsight is always 20/20, but getting from here to the year 20 is difficult to get. So with that, let's look at the history. Forecasting is necessary. Every industry does that. Doesn't matter which industry you're in. You could be in running a parlor, a grocery, or a pie man. You need to forecast what your future is, what it's tomorrow is, would be your requirement, what next week would be, how much should I invest into it. So that's always important. And one of the historical landmarks that most of us remember is the 70s, when the oil crisis hit. And this caused a total change of the methodology that was done in terms of forecasting energy. So in terms of load forecasting or energy forecasting, is the first step that you require in energy planning process. And in terms of the requirement, it's done by our electric utilities. They have to do their forecast to know what they need to do in the future, what type of plan to put in. Policymakers, meaning depending on who owns your utility, and manufacturers and suppliers, depending on what they get into in terms of the future, what they see the future as. So we have two words that come up all the time in our forecasting, which are demand and consumption. And instead of using load, which an individual will use in terms of maintenance, we are going to use demand and consumption. Energy is in terms of megawatt hours and kilowatt hours, and power is difference between them is time. So energy is power multiplied by time. Demand forecast is what you do to determine the capacity of generation and transmission and distribution that you require. And the energy forecast is to determine the type of generation facilities required. In this time of low carbon footprints, it will also give you an indication of what your carbon footprint target would be, and depending on what is that in terms of how much or what value of renewable energy plant you need to put into your system in order to reduce my footprint to the particular target value. So when we look at this, you look at your demand side energy savings, and from your demand side energy savings alternatives, I get my load projections. And of course, my load projections could give me different curves. So which one of them should I use? Then the cost of alternative supplies that I can utilize, whether it's hydro, if it's a possibility, if it's wind, if it's another fossil type fuel plant I have to have, or if I am in an island which has geothermal, I probably can look at that particular type. And that will give me straight into the environmental impacts, social impacts, which will taper into my production costs, including the social cost estimates. Then I look at my rate of return, pricing, incentives for the utility and the customers, and that from that will get my revenue, my cash flow, in terms of whether I will be making a profit, and whether the project in terms of the plant that I'm going to put in, whether these plant I'm going to put in, whether I have a bankable project. Because in the end, someone has to pay for it. A lot of us who grew up in an era, especially in Trinidad, where the government is the owner of the power company, we forget that it must be a bankable project, because in the end, someone has to pay for it. And even if it's a government project, like our utility TNTech here, in the end, taxpayers pay for it. They don't understand it most of the time, but they actually pay for it in the end. So our objective in load forecasting is, one, to minimize the error in our prediction, and to consider the risks facing the utility and the sector while we are doing this particular projection. Should our projection, we'll be looking at an 8% projection, a 3% projection, or is the demand going to remain stationary because of COVID? Has it dropped because of COVID? There are so many things that you could not cater for, or like in St. Vincent, you have no demand, right? Not because there's no requirement, but because of a calamity. So from a planning perspective, the demand forecast that you require should always be a little higher than what you actually need, because what you need to take care of would be two things. Basically, one, maintenance, and if I'm doing maintenance, I must bring down a plant off and on at some regular interval. And also another aspect that occurs and will always occur with equipment, unplanned failure, shutdown. So you need reserves that you have to plan for in that particular aspect. So what do we use our load forecast for? First one is cost of service. And the cost of service is just like a balance sheet. You have to take into account everything that is required to produce this electricity on the grid, carry it across the grid to the consumer home, and provide the particular reliability that you want. And it is from the cost of service analysis that the regulator utilized all this information to decide what is an acceptable rate of return that the utility should have, and hence would now peg the rates according to that particular aspect. So in terms of my rate design, we have our consumption that will be produced for each class, and many a times you will find that the regulator will probably be dependent on the particular consumption pattern in terms of the residential or domestic, commercial, and industrial customers. You might find sometime a regulator may decide, okay, we probably might have a little cross-subsidization, but in the end, overall, we have a particular value in terms of a return that you will get. And we also need to understand what the demand response would be for customers in terms of ensuring that we control and manage the demand on the system. One of the things that you will come up with that a lot of us in this area don't take particular cognizance of is that many times I could defer plant and defer an expenditure by just doing some proper demand management and trying to taper and temper the response of the customers and helping them to do that. And it will cost, while you might see it as an immediate cost to the utility, you will find if you do the projection in the long run, the mere fact that you are deferring an expenditure, that cost alone will more than pay for the demand suppression that you can do. And finally, energy efficiency. One of the issues that you must look at, and this is one of the low-hanging fruits that you will find in many areas, is efficiency. And efficiency is one of the easiest way to actually restrain growth and taper your growth to a pattern that you want and that you can afford. So once we have looked at all those areas in terms of generalities, let's look at how we look at the loads, which is really what we, in the end, when we add all of them together, becomes our demand in terms of for electricity or for energy. So in this particular graphic, we have all our loads here, and we see that our residential load peaks at a particular time, which is like 6 p.m. Okay. And then we have our commercial load, which peaks at 2 p.m. And then we have our industrial load, which is kind of flat. And that's because most industries are 24/7 operation. So you find that they give you a nice flat curve, which help balance the load. Agricultural load are way down here. So we have a total demand in the day of this top curve, where I have basically two peaks, one at 2 o'clock and one at 6 o'clock. And in this particular customer profile that you have for this utility, the peaks are being driven by my commercial load and by my residential load peaks. So let's look at some from that particular graphics that we had before this here. Let's look at some general definitions. The first one is demand. It's a load average over a specific time. The demand is your load average over a specific time. So the main word there is average. It's an average value. And that's because most utilities average your consumption over a period of time, and it's typically 15 minutes. It's a 15-minute running average of the power that you're consuming. And that gives you my load. And it can be given in various units. So it can be kilowatt, kVAR, kVA, or amps, depending on the particular utility you're dealing with. Then we have maximum demand, and it's the largest demand over the time period. And this time period we had here was 15 minutes. So the largest demand you had at that time. When we're looking at maximum demand, we cannot assume that it's a 15-minute aggregate that we're doing. We must know that. So therefore, I must ask and know what is the demand time that I'm averaging over. So if we say it's 15 minutes, we can say, okay, our maximum demand for the week is 150 kilowatt in these several 15-minute periods that I have looked at. So in the day, I can break up an hour is broken up into 4 15 minutes. And therefore, if I look at the peaks that I had before, let's say at 2 o'clock and 6 o'clock, I break that up into 4 15-minute period. And the largest of those 15-minute period now becomes my maximum demand for the particular day. And of course, if I want to extend that, I can get the maximum demand for a month or the maximum demand for a year. And then I have average demand, is the average of all the demands. And again, the word is average in terms of a specific period, and whatever the period. So we initially look at 15 minutes. It can also be a day, it could be a week, it could be a month, it could be a year. Then we have 3 other factors which give me an indication of how the utility and how the consumer is using the equipment. I have demand factor, which is the ratio of the maximum demand to the total connected load, maximum demand to the total connected load. And this tells you really how you're utilizing your loads in terms of your maximum demand. A lot of people pay a lot of money, especially commercial and industrial customers, because their maximum demand is placed a little too high to their total connected load. Then we have diversity factor, which is the maximum non-coincident demand divided by the maximum diversified demand. And this basically says, when we say non-coincident demand, we mean these are the individual 15-minute demand, the maximum of that, divided by, this is the total diversified, means all of them coming together. And remember the top curve that I get, and that particular demand. And then the load factor is the average demand of an individual or a group of customers divided the maximum demand for the same period. So these are 3 ratios that you'll see a lot, just like you have ratios in your financial analysis. These are the 3 ratios that you will see a lot in your electrical analysis in terms of load forecasting. So if I look at that in my load classification, let's look at a domestic customer. Typically, we have a demand factor between 70 and 100%, diversity factor of 1.2 to 1.3, and a load factor of 10 to 15%. We look at commercial. Our commercial customer has a demand factor of 90%, a diversity factor of 1.1 to 1.12, and a load factor of 25 to 30%. So you notice my load factor is going up from domestic to commercial. It's going up. And we look at our industrial. Our industrial has a demand factor of 70 to 80% and a load factor of 60 to 65%. And if you come to Trinidad, you will find that our big industrial loads, our load factor is very close to 100%, okay? Because they run steadily for 24/7. And then finally, we have our street lights. Our demand factor is 100% because it's all of them are on at the same time. Our diversity factor is 1.0. That's because they're all on at the same time and the connected load is the same amount that is on. And the load factor should be and off in the day, right? So let's look at load growth. When we look at our load growth, we must take into account not just the normal econometric growth of the customers, but new customers. And new customers in terms of increased electrification initiatives, new construction in terms of new housing, in terms of commercial housing, commercial centers, industrial facilities, whatever industry might come in, and population relocation, where you have new villages being relocated, or usually this is driven a lot in these small islands by the government's policy for housing. And they've decided to develop a housing complex in a particular area. So that will require a new demand in an area that you never had. And also we have new usages. And especially as the customers become a little more savvy in terms of their use and they have more household equipment, we have people moving from gas stoves to electric stoves. You have air conditioning, and now air conditioning seems to be a requirement to all people living in the West Indies. And I would like to point out to you before now that I have found in my own little experience is that while people are saying that that's the younger people, that the place is getting hotter, someone like me will tell you that it has not really gotten hotter. What has happened is that people have gotten accustomed to air conditioning, and they have so many microclimates in their home that they're accustomed to a particular type of climate in their home that when they come outside, their bodies are not accustomed to this. So this gives you a big load. Everyone has to have air conditioning now. And it's not only on the hot day they want air conditioning, they want air conditioning 24 hours. The other use that is going to come up is electric vehicles. Once the penetration rate of electric vehicles increase, and it's going to increase, you're going to get a larger usage of electricity for charging electric vehicles, and that will increase the peaks for the domestic customers quickly because they're going to charge almost the same time, the 6 o'clock that you saw over there. They're going to plug in the vehicle at the same time as they plug in their cell phones. And then you have several areas with energy storage. And energy storage is here is because to put the energy in there, we must get it from the line. So they'll have this here. And renewable energy technologies are only there because it's not going to give me a growth, but it probably will give me the requirement that, and this is something that most people don't take into account. If I put in 50 megawatts of renewable energy on my system, and I want to utilize this for 50 megawatts, let's say, of photovoltaics, I must have backing up this 50 megawatts of photovoltaics, 50 megawatts of fossil fuel plants. Most people believe that once I put in these, I don't need the fossil fuel. But just think one moment. Photovoltaics, once a cloud passes over it, it goes from 50 to almost zero immediately. And if I lose 50 megawatts from my system almost instantaneously, I'm going to suffer major power failure. To prevent that loss of load, the utility will have to back that up with an equivalent amount of generation from some other system. And therefore, whilst I may be reducing my footprint there, we have to take into account the calculation to have these plants running on bars in terms of the amount of carbon emissions that are occurring because of these plants, and they are necessary. So let's look at load forecasting, how we go about it. There are several things that come into the load forecasting mixture in terms of what we need to do, the network planning that I need, the capacity planning, buying the power purchase agreements, renewable energy planning, the transmission and distribution system, transformers that I may need, efficiencies, all those things coming together. So we need a technique that will quantitatively put all this into the mix and give me a value which I can work in terms of helping me to define where my load is most likely to go to so that I can do my proper planning and purchasing in terms of if I have to buy new equipment for my system in terms of load growth. So I can break up my planning, my forecasting into 3 time frames. They're short-term load forecasting, medium-term load forecasting, and long-term load forecasting. Each one is utilized differently. And each one has its own utility requirement, that is, for use, and it's required for different planning purposes. So let's see if we can define them very quickly. Short-term. It's a method where I'm very quickly looking at what is the growth or the expected load in 1 to 2 hours, sometimes what it is in a work day compared to a work week, and make sure I have enough plant on the bars or on the system to make sure that I can supply this load as a growth. As you start to put in more renewable energy systems here, and this is when I say renewable energy, here I'm talking about either photovoltaics, renewable energy systems, because those are not dispatchable and they can go down and up very quickly. I'm not talking about hydro and geothermal, because I can predict those in terms of a longer than 1 week, one to 2 weeks and so forth. So I want to know really what do I need, or what the consumption would look like in the next hour or two, or a week, things like that. And one of the issues you have with photovoltaics and wind is that there's no way I can really predict when a cloud will pass. And there's no way when I can really predict when I will get a reduction in the wind speed, or the wind speed goes to zero. However, what I do know is that wind speeds don't go to zero immediately, but irradiance, meaning the sun energy that is falling onto the photovoltaics, can go to zero immediately by a cloud cover. So that's the kind of thing you're playing with in photovoltaics. I also need to look in terms of my short term. It's a limited horizon in terms of prediction. And here we have temperature prediction. One of the fortunate things we have in the Caribbean is that our temperature is, we think it swings a lot, but if you compare it with temperate country, it's a 10 degree you're talking about, okay? And we look at our mean absolute percentage error. We know from our history that is about a 5% is good, but it's typically down to less than 2%. So we can get it at that. And the techniques that I can utilize in terms of estimation are many time series analyses, which might be AR, ARX, ARIMA, ARMA, multiple regression, expert systems, fuzzy logic, particle swarms. So it depends. There are plethora of techniques that you can use. So you must know which one is being utilized in your software, and what each particular technique has its advantages and its disadvantages and its limitations. So you must know those. So what a short-term forecasting do, it will provide are the necessary information for daily operations, for security analysis, economic dispatch, fuel scheduling, all as part of what the machine on board, maintenance, and unit commitment. So in that particular aspect, we can see that this simple short-term forecasting is. If we look at medium-term forecasting, this gives me a range which is a little longer than the short-term, 1 week to 1 year, where I'm looking to see how the load is going to grow or move in that particular time. And we have historical data which can guide us on that, because it's longer term, so I can use the past years to give me that particular growth. And for different time horizons, different operations for the utility. So I can know that, okay, let's look at a hypothetical case. I know that during the rainy season, air condition use is not as high as in the sunny season, okay, when I have the sunny season period. So I know that I can, and probably that's the time I need to do my maintenance on my equipment. So I can do those kind of things, and I know exactly where to do my maintenance just by predicting what would happen. And I can also look at when I have my fuel requirements, schedule my supplies, whatever management and maintenance I need to do, and so forth. The one that is a little difficult to do, difficult in the sense that you can do it, but your confidence level is a little lower, is long-term forecasting. And this is for longer than a year. It depends on what you're going to do it for, what you're going to do the forecasting for, right? It's to give me a precise prediction of the future needs for expansion, equipment purchase, staff hiring. So I have to be kind of fairly accurate, because a little off on this, I can commit a lot of money to my bottom line, and I can move from a good position to a bad position, or I cannot do what I was supposed to do, and I end up with a position where I have to shed load because I don't have enough load for the particular growth. Or you can be be like in a Trinidad environment where it doesn't matter how much you forecast. If you bring in one major plant in Trinidad, that throws you off completely. So many a time you can do all the forecasting you want in Trinidad, and then there is an investor who comes in and brings in a plant which requires 100 megawatts of power. That throws off everything that you could have planned for. But all it can tell you is that when someone does that, you have to give them a lead time when you can do this, right? And there are two methods of doing my long-term forecasting: top-down method and the bottom-up method. That's in terms of the organization, from the top to the bottom. So I do it from at the top, and I feed it to the bottom. I take information from the bottom and come back to the top. So let's look at the factors now, or horizon. Short term, the two main factors we look at in short term would be weather and load. In weather, we have temperature, humidity, wind speed, rainfall, cloud cover, and our load, hourly, daily, weekly, peak, average, things like that. Medium term, I use everything in the short term, plus how the economy is performing. So our customer income, are they growing? The population growth, the population size, and the GDP. Is my GDP going up, or is my GDP is going up? If GDP is going up, my consumption is going to go up in terms of that. How elastic is my consumption with economy growth? And long term, basically my long term, the weather pattern is not what is so important there, because weather is very short term. Is the load growth and the economy. And the economy plays the most important part here in my long-term growth. And that's where most of my errors really lie, especially when you have a very small country. The economy moves very, very differently in that there's no way to average what is happening. Usually, if you have a very big country, you might find one part of the country is in recession, and the other part is moving ahead. But when you average it, okay, you can do a good forecast. But in a small country, let's look at this like COVID. COVID could throw everything off completely, right? Everybody in the country has the same issue. So let's look at top-down forecasting. In terms of top-down forecasting, we have to develop efficient, consistent, and business-oriented decision. So we look at our weather indices, and now this top-down forecasting is being done by people at the planning level, just at the organization. I have one group that is doing this at the planning level. Okay, and I need to take into account my operation, my temperature, my cooling degree days. That's in terms of what temperature we're looking at, how many days I require heavy cooling. That would be basically in your hot season, all right? And like I said, we could have used this in the past, but this has now become as though the cooling degrees day is 365 days for the year for most people. We also require a macroeconomic overview of the economy to give us really growth, what the government is doing, what the government plans are, price of electricity, interest rate, inflation, when the government is going to change, because if government changes, many of these plans go to our wayside or go into a folder in terms of wait until a while. So all those things get thrown into the mix, and we have to develop models for each class of customer in terms of how they are going to operate, and what are the correlation in terms of each class, in terms of the climate or the weather pattern, in terms of temperature variable. And one of the points that we put here is that there's a higher correlation with temperature for the domestic customer than it is to our industrial load. Okay. And then we must develop our scenarios in terms of this particular aspect, or whether the weather conditions, the economic projections, energy policies, revenue class, in terms of one group, a separate group, put them together, and what would be the average of the value in those particular areas. So that's the top, and what the top down does is that one group of people would be doing this, and they will send the information down to everyone. So if I have the same group here is doing this, then it means that they would develop particular efficiency in how to do this, and they become better in time. The bottomed up forecasting method is a method where I have multiple teams with the similar skill sets are developing the forecast. And they are going to, so it's geographically dispersed, and they are going to give me the information which feeds up to the top. And then after the top just aggregates and gives me the value. Now the bottom top up load forecasting method is more suitable to a large country, let's say a continent type country, where you will have different localized aspect, which is different to island. In an island, of course, the bottom down technique would be the more appropriate one. So therefore it becomes inefficient, inconsistent, and doesn't meet the business needs of the geographical area, as the area is not large enough. And so in terms of our particular environment, and our meaning the Caribbean environment, a top-down forecasting method would be the better one to do. So let's look at forecasting in terms of we can over forecast and we can under forecast. Both of them will cost us money, right? Both of them. If you overshoot or if you undershoot, it's going to cost you money. So if you look at over forecasting, upgrading in the infrastructure will cause increased spending, or if you under forecast and insufficient spending. So let's look at each one: rates, generation, transmission, distribution. This is your whole utility here. Over forecasted gives me more investment, less investment than is needed. Cost of service will be different. Demand response, of course, if I over forecast, it means I put in more plan than you need. If I under forecast, I have less plan than is needed. And of course, I'll get load problems and I will get shutdown problems and efficiencies as can be. Forecasting horizon. The forecasting horizon must cover your planning horizon. And when we come to the second part, we'll see why it is many times my planning horizon and my forecasting horizon clash, because sometimes I don't have the data to do it. And because the longer my forecast horizon is, and it becomes more unpredictable, of course, the less data I have in terms of historical data, the more my error will be, or the greater the error percentage is going to be. And many times you require very long years of history, which I don't have. And therefore we need to do different methods and different mathematical techniques I need to apply to give me my particular application. So there are two remedial methods that you can utilize to help you in the fact when I don't have sufficient data. One, I can make the forecast updating cycle less than half the length of the data history cycle. So I do an iterative process over, and it becomes a little better in terms of, and I can reduce my forecasting horizon too. And I can get into a probabilistic load forecast, so I can take into account the associated uncertainties. However, probabilistic load forecast requires you to understand the parameters you're dealing with very, very good. You have to know them in very detail, because now you're getting into the is no different to taking a chance but applying mathematics to it. And therefore you must understand the strength and weakness of this. But however, if you do it properly, you can get a very good idea where you're going. So this slide just gives you a horizon for each one of the particular area. Financial planning, we updating cycle 1 to 5 years, forecast 1 to 20 years. So you see, although I'm going 20 years, I have 1 to 5 and I update every time, so I can update this. So I have a rolling value that I can do here all the time. 5 to 30 years, because I need this kind of horizon in terms of buying new plant and equipment. Transmission, 1 to 2, 5 to 30. It's the same thing as generation, because the transmission plant is what carries the power out to the customers. Distribution, 1 to 2 years, 1 to 20 years. So it's smaller because of the growth, and it can be less than this if my GDP is growing and my population is also growing. IRRP, 3 to 10 years. My forecast horizons 10 to 50 years. So I'm updated very fast here because I'm looking at the long horizon. And renewable energy, 1 to 2 years, 1 to 30 years is our horizon. But one thing to remember about renewable energy, which most people seem to miss, is the fact that the lifespan of a renewable energy plant currently is not as long as a fossil fuel plant. So your horizon here for changing the plant is much shorter, okay? The other aspect we look at is our long-term demand forecast. And this here really shows me what can happen in terms of doing different type of forecast. And here we have the actual demand until 2015. And we can do 2 forecasts, and this forecast was done for this period of time. And one with the growth rate, the compounded growth rate, I use 2.7% will take me here. But if I use 3.6% compounded growth rate, it takes me here. And if I take any point in time, let's say 2030, it means that my 2.7% tells me I should have 2,200 terawatts of power required, terawatt hour of energy, sorry. But if I use 3.65, it gives me 2,500 terawatt hours of energy that I need to supply. Big difference. And that could give you some of the errors that you have that can occur by a simple, and this is only a 1% difference in terms of my forecast percentage growth. So in the horizon that we're dealing with, and the fact that you're compounding the errors, you're going to see a big divergence in terms of the estimates, and you have to be very, very careful in terms of how you're looking at this growth. And this is where my data, how confident my data is. So therefore, if I'm forecasting and I'm forecasting a trend, this is why we said, okay, I can do the forecast for 1 to 20 years, but every 5 years, 5 to 6 years, I go back and do a forecast again and make sure that I know where my curve is going, because I have new data. I would have 5 to 6 years of new data, which I can put into the system and get back a new forecast. The economy may have changed at that time too. So I can put in the new econometric data into my system. My interest rates would have changed too. Everything would have changed. So I can always update this and run a rolling average all the time and get the values. And if we look at what can happen in a long-term forecast, and this here is just to show you the errors, it's just for you to understand what can happen pictorially in terms of getting a forecast wrong, right? So if you look at it, we look at it again here, okay? This is a forecast which was done, let's say in the year 1972, around 73, around there, 74. And look at what has happened. This is what we projected. We projected for the value in 1985, 86. I project from 74, 7.5%. And these are the lower values I'm projected. And this is where the growth is. However, with data, the growth actually was here, was 3.2%. And you can see the big differences that you can get there by just 1% error each time. And that's why it's essential that once I've done a forecast, remember, the forecast is not cast in stone. It's just like a short circuit study. It's not cast in stone. It's the value I have for a particular period, and I need to go and redo this forecast again to give me a better idea of what is going on. The most difficult forecast to do is the first one you have ever done. Once you have done the first one, then it becomes easier because it's just modifying what you have done, getting a little better handle on what the data is like, how to manipulate the data, which one of the techniques to utilize, which one of the regression analyses to utilize, which one gives me a better handle of what's happening. And I will get better, but once I ensure that it's not a done deal, I have to go back and redo this and do it like a rolling average. Okay, every 5 years you go back and you do it again, make sure you're on target. And in any case, most of the time you need to do that when you're going for rate increase. Okay, you need to do some of that for the regulator. So that's what happens when you're doing your demand forecast. And that's the main thing here, is to show you there are techniques to do it, but it is filled with a lot of errors if you don't pay attention to what are the parameters that you're using and how those parameters can vary in time, and how one small change in a parameter can throw your forecast off completely. So that falls into the fact that I should also do a sensitivity analysis and ensure that I understand which is my most sensitive parameter for my system, and that guides me to look at that parameter more, or two, which it might be one or two parameters, and make sure that these two parameters, which are the ones controlling the curve, are following the forecast prediction that I had for it. Okay. So I will stop here for my colleague to take over. So we'll have a short break. Yeah. Sherry, how are we going to do it?
All right, we have a few questions, Prof.
Okay.
I noticed you were really underscoring the importance of integrated planning in terms of being able to predict, because we can't predict for all the major shocks, whether it's a demand shock, as you had mentioned, a new industrial plant, or it's a disaster like what we've been facing with COVID, and now what we're seeing happening in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. But how do you actually go about getting everyone on board to reduce the risk in your long-term plan?
Well, you're talking about your team, is that it, right?
Yes. So once you're doing the planning for
Okay.
a member state is doing their plan. How you can't predict for everything, but how do you reduce your risk?
How you mitigate most of the risk?
Yes.
Right. Well, firstly, you have to sensitize the people you're dealing with, and might be government, might be other legislators, might be your own team in the utility. You have to sensitize them as to the vagaries of what you're doing here in terms of what happened. And what could really give you a good handle is that if I have enough data, I could take that data and in retrospect do a forecast for the period, for the time I am now, and show how far you can go wrong if you didn't do this thing in the proper planning process. And if you had someone who had done a planning before, you can go back and get that planning document and compare it with where you are, like the last curve that I showed, right? And show that how these things can change in time. But to mitigate it, like I said, the only way you can mitigate something like this, and it's not you would not even really be able to mitigate it if it goes wrong completely. You can only minimize it, is to continue doing the refresh on the exercise, because you will always have new information. You'll have new data in terms of where the curve is. You'll also have new data on the economy. You'll have new econometric data. So you continue doing it and seeing if it's, and you change your curve as you go ahead. However, natural disasters are something, because a natural disaster in any one of the islands is going to wipe everything out. You really cannot plan for that. And that's where we believe that a Caribbean agency is the only thing that can help you in a system like that. The other Caribbean islands have to come together to help that particular island, which has suffered from a disaster. Now, like in the St. Vincent case, that's in an island, right? It might be a few islands, right? So you have probably a CARICOM disaster management agency, or CARICOM the agency, which will look at that to help you to look at that. But you really cannot mitigate a disaster like a volcano or a hurricane, major hurricane that comes through. It is unplanned and which no one knows, no one can do that. What we can do is that we can plan as a group of islands, and I'm going to use CARICOM. It may not be the best vehicle, but we'll use CARICOM. Center, and we have our resources there. And once this were to happen to any of the island or islands, then this group kicks in and we get resources from the other places which are not affected, like the islands that we're dealing with. That's all you can do with something like that. It's just like, and it's no different to put in a photovoltaic plant. You can mitigate for a cloud cover. But all you can do, if there's a cloud cover, you must have other plant running so that when it happens, you come on. The other plant, this case is CARICOM.
Okay, all right. Thank you for that, Prof. And we know that there are plans in place to help islands to mitigate those shocks when they. We have a comment here from one of our participants that says they think we can improve the accuracy of a long-term demand forecast if we include a wide range of social variables in the regression analysis testing. What are your thoughts on that?
That's true. The problem you have with that is that mathematically we can use all kind of things, and my colleague will bring in all that when he comes in, when he looks at some of the mathematical techniques. The problem you have with that in the Caribbean is that the agencies, which is the CSO, the Central Statistical Offices in all the islands, are not really accurate in their data that they have. So if you look at, let's look at Trinidad. I'll use Trinidad so I don't use anybody else. I live in Trinidad. In Trinidad, if I go to the CSO and I ask for statistics, but I will not get any statistics that I can rely on. As a matter of fact, in Trinidad, we know that we do not use any statistics of the CSO. As a matter of fact, industry has better statistics than the CSO. And that's because not enough funding is placed in the CSOs of the islands, because many of the politicians don't even understand the requirement for these kind of data. We have an advantage though in the Caribbean in that many of the data points that I need in terms of the controlling parameter they're not many. There are not many controlling parameters that you will get in a first world country, because you have a larger population, diverse climate, things like that. So you have few parameters that you can focus on, which will control the graph. And once I know those few parameters, about 3 or 4, not much more than that. And if I get that from the central bank, CSO, I pick it up from other major utilities, and I work with that, I can get a good prediction. However, because the island is so small, one simple change, right? Let's say we're on an island which is tourism bound, and you have a simple change in terms of the tourist destination requirement. That throws off everything completely, totally. If you have an island like Trinidad, where the growth in our demand forecast for the utility is driven by not domestic customers, but commercial and industrial customers, then it becomes a little easier in that when an industrial customer comes in, he comes for a long term. So he has a long horizon. However, what it means is if he closes down, like what has been happening now, then you have an excess of plant on your system. So you have a kind of reverse requirement in that we have more excess plant now, we need to get customers for the plant. Mm-hmm. So the islands are all unique and peculiar, have their peculiarities, and you have to know which peculiarity you're dealing with in the island, and that will guide you as to which parameters are the important parameters in the econometric model.
All right, I think we have just a few more questions. When is it required to process data to specifically identify holidays or special events for forecasting?
Well, if you're in an island like Trinidad, we know when all the holidays are. And we have history in terms of what the holidays will do for consumption. So in consumption, there are only 2 areas where the pattern will change, and that will be Domestic customers will change immediately, okay? And the commercial customers will change depending on if the holiday falls on a weekday or a weekend. The industrial customers don't change at all. So we can know that. So it's peculiar to every country. Every island will have to look at their pattern, their consumption pattern, and see which is the leading consumer. The graph that I showed before at the beginning, the commercial customer was the leader. So that and the domestic customers were the ones who are going to lead the change in pattern. Whereas if you come to Trinidad, while the domestic is only about 30% of the consumption, the other 60% is really commercial and industrial. So that's why our load pattern is much flatter than any island that you'll find. So you have to know your particular location and know what's going on to really get a good answer on that. But you can tell what it is going to happen.
Okay. All right. Can you give a little bit more background on why the renewable energy forecasting is shorter? I think you mentioned a bit, but they're asking
The
for some more
renewable energy,
on that.
I didn't catch the last part. The renewable energy forecast.
Why that forecast is shorter.
Oh, renewable energy
plants.
Yeah, renewable energy, and we are talking about two types here only. We're talking about wind and photovoltaic. So they are variable sources. And once you have variable sources, you're not sure, you have very low confidence in what the next hour will be, the output of the plant. And because you're not sure what the next hour would be, what you have in renewable energy in terms of wind and photovoltaic is that the plant is not dispatchable, meaning that I cannot predict that I can have, let's say I have a 100 megawatt plant, I can have 100 megawatt in the next hour from the photovoltaic. So if you look at every renewable energy plant in the Caribbean, you are never paid for 100 megawatt. You're paid for megawatt hours. You're paid for energy. And somebody has to provide the power because the power is varying. So whilst you'll see in a fossil fuel plant, you'll see a price for energy and capacity. Capacity is the power. So KVA, you'll have a KVA price for the KVA and a price for the energy produced. In a renewable energy plant, the owners of the plant don't ever do their power purchase on that. Their power purchase is energy, how much energy I can deliver over a period of time. That's all. They're not going to sell you and tell you that you're going to get so much power because they themselves cannot predict that power. And what it means is that because they cannot predict that power, the other utilities, which are the legacy utilities, have to ensure that I have sufficient generators on bar when this power goes down. Because sun disappear, cloud cover, wind stop blowing, that I don't lose 100 megawatt of power plant. That these are running hot standby and they come up immediately and take over the energy that it was supplied. Or else you're going to get a power failure. You're going to get an unreliable supply of power. That's basically where the problem lies.
Okay. How does implementing energy storage compare with maintaining spinning reserve as it relates to firming up power from the intermittent renewables?
Well, spinning reserve is having power on the bars all the time. So you're already paid for it, basically. All right. Battery backup is a method where I am having these batteries waiting there in case I need power. But battery backup is extremely expensive. And battery backup is for short-term power. It's very, very, very short-term in terms of where you can do right now. If I want to get, and if you look at battery backup, you'll realize, and we're talking for the power grid, I'm not talking about battery backup for a computer, right? For power grid, you're talking about battery backup in terms of megawatt hours. And the size of batteries that I can utilize for that will only give me in terms of economics, will only give me power for a minute, 2 minutes, a few cycles, right? Once I cross those kind of values, it becomes exorbitantly prohibitive. And if I'm going to put those kind of batteries in the system, it's going to hit the rates. Somebody has to pay for it. And battery backup supplies roughly is at least 3 times the normal power rate. Now, if you put one, that value is going to spread over every customer. So you don't see it much. But once I put a bigger one, you will see it start because you're going to have to pay for it.
Okay. All right. Final question. Not sure if this is going to be addressed today or in the follow-up session, but this one is about the software used for forecasting and dispatching. If we can get more information on that.
Well, for dispatching, each utility, depending on the vendor that they have, because the dispatching actually is linked to the vendor of the generator, right? For instance, renewable energy system wouldn't have a dispatching software because they are not dispatchable. So depending on which generator. So if you look at what happens in a big country, there is a central system operator who will do the dispatching, and he buys the power from everybody else. He becomes the aggregator and he does the dispatch. Now, depending on who he bought this dispatch routine from, Itron might be one in Trinidad. Okay, you will have each vendor has its own dispatching routine, and they will have it. So it's vendor specific. But what it does is the same thing that every one of them would do. And because it's vendor specific, it's actually done for the particular utility that you're dealing with. In the Caribbean, because the utilities are one, it's not many. So it's dependent on what utility you're dealing with. That's for dispatching. For forecasting, my other colleague will touch on some of that. Okay, but there are various things to use in forecasting. Okay. You can even write your own routine.
All right. Thank you for that, Prof. We will give you a break and we will hand over to Dr. Who will take us through the second half of the presentation. And just to let you know that after the session today, we will be sharing the presentation as well as the recording will be uploaded to our YouTube channel. So you'll be able to refresh your memory after we have completed the session today. So Sanjay.
All right, thank you, Sherry. And continuing on what we would have discussed before, a lot of the questions seem to be going along the path of getting a little more details into this modeling. And what is particularly useful about this section is it's information rich with technical details, and I hope we can get some of that covered. Hopefully it's not too deep, but it should give us an insight. So if we look at some of the factors to consider, what would they be? Well, first we need to look at our class of customers. We would separate our customers into the various classes: residential, commercial, industrial, agricultural, public. And then of course, we look at our special events. The conversation that I was listening to with you all started along the lines of the public holidays, which is a known variable. There are other special events which could even be discretized a little more, television programs. And that has also been, another key event where we can see changes in the load profile. Then of course you have the population, the economic indicators, whatever you choose, your GNP or GDP. And then of course you have the electricity price, which is a major one. You have the elasticity of your customers. And then of course you're looking at, as technology changes and we have these new trends, what does that impact in terms of our consumption? We look a little further, we could break that down into the hours of the day, whether we're looking at daylight hours or the nighttime, weekdays or weekends. Is it going to be seasonal? Fortunately for us in the Caribbean, we have Well, most of us, we have limited variation in seasonal effects. And then, of course, we always hear about the weather conditions. The thing about the weather conditions, temperature and humidity actually play a lot more of an influential role in this region. We always hear about the climate change. What is the role that climate change is going to impact on our loads? So this is where it ties in very nicely. And then, of course, when we talk about application use, how are we actually utilizing that electricity? What is providing this shift, this transition? We could go a little further now and say, because we have identified this customer class, we know exactly which class, we know about electric vehicles, we identify that we have distributed generation, we have this renewable energy generation, and how does that impact on storage? So, or building blocks. Well, CCREEE has captured it quite nicely here. And what is key here for us is to recognize that when we have a demand, we have the building envelope, we have the equipment, and we have the lighting. This affects these localized ecosystems. And of course, each element here has an appropriate list of factors that influence them. And what you can see is temperature affects your lighting, temperature affects your building envelope, temperature affects your equipment. The air quality, the humidity, they play a roles in different parts. So how do we know what is the equivalent impact associated with each type of variable? Well, more importantly, the impact as well as the equivalent cost. The two are related. We would like to get some models because we need to identify what would be the equivalent mitigation scenarios that we need to identify, where that vulnerability lies, and part of understanding that risk is also ensuring that we get our models as best as we can given the limitations that we have. So let's look at weather. Weather is often discussed at length, and we talk about weather and how do they impact, well, mostly on the domestic and the commercial side, and particularly public lighting. We would look at the meteorological elements over a 2-week window. It is very difficult to capture more than that 2-week window, but major weather variables have been listed here. We have temperature, cloud cover, visibility, precipitation, rainfall, thunderstorm, flooding, wind speed. However, temperature and cloud cover affects cooling, visibility, and precipitation will affect your lighting. The heights of the cloud cover, the thickness, the cloud amount, the time of day, all these other elements now come in, and you need to consider these main weather variables that will affect the load, and we need to correlate them. But the weather variables, as I mentioned, have a short time horizon that you can accurately predict, and therefore we utilize a short-term versus a long-term load forecasting to map it, because many key weather variables can't be predicted beyond 2 weeks accurately. And what may happen is if you're looking beyond a 2-week horizon, you tend to go towards a simulation, and a simulation looks at a different model. There's of course some degree of inaccuracy and error depending on where you get your data from, the nature of the model, but that's one technique if you're looking beyond that 2-week window. The other thing is that there's a trade-off between the information added when you add more weather variables, because you will soon realize that some weather variables, just like temperature and humidity, influence the load profile more than others in this region. So what you really want to do is identify who are the heavy hitters and how accurate you need to have that data. And what is key here to recognize is that the accuracy of the data set that is aligned with your load data is key to ensuring that you have a good model. They should both have the same, or at least in the case of the weather, a smaller time step horizon than your load data. So you would want to have a weather variable model at a significantly a smaller resolution. So when we create these scenarios, what we are actually doing is we are looking at the impact of these variables. And by doing this, we will now have an opportunity to say, well, from a long-term perspective, well, not long, from a short-term perspective at least, what happens if there's a change in a particular variable? What we ideally trying to do here is capture, do we need to have better weather resolution? Should we have the same? But we want to have studies that can confirm the validation of including the variables, because at the end of the day, we know temperature has a very strong correlation, but we want to include the others only if it adds sufficient value and accuracy. And that remains to be seen. So you'll have to look at that. So let's look at temperature. Temperature is the most significant variation on loads. And temperature variables alone can explain for like 70% of the load variation. And in load forecast models, proper temperature ranges and average temperatures should be utilized. Now, heating and cooling plays a part, but in this region, we only need to look at cooling primarily. And this adds a little bit of simplification to our challenge, and which is something I'll explain, because the complementing factor with temperature is humidity, and it's non-linearly related. So in the cases of extreme heat, what you're looking at is air conditioning will come into play. Added to the fact that you'll have the humidity on top of it, well, you could be able to correlate temperature and the humidity, and therefore what you come up with would be a model that potentially shows a linkage to the load pattern. What this image here on the screen provides is a measure that this is off of 2020, right? For 9 months of the year, at least identifying for the year 2016 that the temperature, that temperature in terms of degrees Celsius, a 1.06 temperature variation, because what you're looking at here is the equivalent of how that variation will impact. And of course, the next slide gives us an appreciation of historically over the entire, well, more than decades, centuries. So 1.06, but look what's happening when we look in the far right-hand corner. What you're seeing here is an appreciation of the trend. And that trend is now captured with respect to a degree rise per decade. So you have an appreciation of long-term, what is happening, short-term, what is happening. You marry those two, and what you'll be able to do is employ them in suitable models. So now we're going to have to marry them. We need to be able to look at the data and come up with these regression models. Now this is where it gets a little technical, because we need to look at this data. First, we need to get this data. We need to get accurate data. And the data would be the weather variables that we believe are linked to climate change. And it must have a link on, it must have a relation to the load demand. Once we get that data, we need to process this data. And let me give you an example of load versus temperature relationship. Here we have 3 graphs on the screen. If you look at the graph, the plots in green, they are all the same. What it varies here would be the model that we use. You have a linear model in the far left, symmetrical in the middle, and an asymmetrical on the right. The linear, piecewise linear, you can see where there's the intersection and we have a V. The second order polynomial regression model, it's curved similar to that of a quadratic. And the asymmetrical, well, you can see it's a third order polynomial. So you can see where it rises and then it decreases and goes again. What we have from this, 3 types of models that can be applied to the same data. So how do you know which is the best fit? This is why these models now play a part in evaluating which one best describes the relationship with load. But if we look at this a little further, which I think is pretty useful, in this particular data set, they cater for heating and cooling. We actually don't need to look at that in this part of the world, in our region. We will only be looking at one portion of the graph. And therefore, if we're only looking at one portion of the graph, the model that we will use becomes significantly easier to adopt, because it may very well be a linear, it may be a quadratic on a particular n. However, when you make that simplification, once you have accurate data, you're going to determine what that relationship is over a smaller horizon of temperature. So it's very useful to identify your operating range. And therefore, when we use data sets that are not from this region, we potentially use models that may not do us justice, particularly in identifying what that load relationship to temperature would be. So how do I go about doing this? Well, we have to take snapshots. We have to take snapshots, monthly snapshots. In this example, there's seasonal variation because it's a temperate climate. I have pulled out here what would be the equivalent of the summer climate that they experience. So June, July, August. What you do see is some measure of consistency. And what you'll be looking to do is take this data, break it down, and analyze over the patterns of months, days, weeks, however you would like to come up with a model that provides an appreciative relationship that can do justice to your load and temperature relationship. So that means that if I were to break it down even further, I now have not only the months, I now have the hourly profile. But guess what's happening? As you break it down into these discrete levels, you're going to find that there's another level of variation. Because while you are looking at a macro level and you go to a micro level, you're going to identify that temperature influences the load. But not only that, there's a lagging effect. And the reason being is that the temperature of the current and the preceding hours affects the load. If it is very warm, you may see that load may increase if there's going to be use of air condition. If the temperature drops, you may potentially see a reduction in load. This effect is called the recency effect. You need to keep this in mind, particularly for a lagged variable. Temperature is one of those lagged variables. And this is just a formula. Don't be intimidated by it at all. But what I want to highlight to you all is you see that temperature at an hour T for a 24-hour window. What you're looking to do is identify over the period of time what is going to be the temperature at those intervals of T. And then what you do from that is you look at exponentially weighted temperatures to assign higher weights to the most recent hours. Why would you want to do this? Well, essentially what you want to identify would be what is going to be the next value of temperature. How can you predict that? So you give some weight to the most recent temperatures because that has a direct link through this time lagging impact on what the load will be. So you can assign weights, you can determine weights. Most importantly, what we're going to do here is identify that time lag variable can be incorporated into a model once we have sufficient data that can give us that model. Now we can do this not only for temperature, but does it make sense? Let's take a look here. There's on the graph on the left, there's an hourly temperature and hourly load. The graph on the right, there's an hourly wind speed and an hourly load. What we are seeing here is the graph on the left has a higher correlation because temperature and load provide some measure of a consistent relationship. It's a little different for wind speed and hourly load in this example. So what we can conclude from this example is that the hourly load and hourly temperature is a high correlation, and therefore it would be worth introducing this variable of temperature into our model to identify what will be the impact, including temperature. Remember, temperature is one variable. You can include as many variables as you would like, but inclusion means that you have to have data to support the model. You have to ensure that that is as accurate as it can possibly be. So now we move to including this temperature data. We include this temperature data via the regression that we would have done to confirm it, and we want to look at this time lag model. and we're going to include it into what will be the equivalent of an econometric model, which is very consistent across the board, particularly in the region here. And when we look at the econometric model, these models are constructed from the economic data, and we utilize statistical inferences to help us. Reading from these points here, what I want you all to get is that we leverage on the relationship with the economic data and the load. So the equations that are estimated are from data that are usually derived from first order conditions. And whether it be a utilization or a profit maximization, because it's some measure of optimization, we want to look at that data, look at the behavior that that data represents, and infer what will be the equivalent of the relationship, whether it be taste, or in this case here, the structure of the technology. What we are looking for is that relationship. So the entire schedule is inferred from a discrete set of observations on agent behavior. If I take these variables, I put them into my model, what I am looking for is the relationship. And they should all have a measure of relationship that can give me some measure of forecasting. How do I create this econometric model? We have 5 basic steps. The first step, we define the likely explanatory variables. We started to do that. We started to look at the customer segmentation. So we identify that we have different classes of customers. We also identify that there may be specific lists of events, and that may influence our electricity consumption, whether it be an increase or a reduction. And then, of course, we identify variables that can potentially play a role in influencing the consumption. The second step will be defining the relationship of these variables with the load demand. We must have an appreciation for the impacts of the lags. If it's lagging, we must understand by how long. So what you're looking for is a time domain analysis that will suggest this lag represented by a t-1, a t-2, whatever it is, but it shows that there's a correlation. And that is key to understanding the assumptions that you have to make, because you want to get that relationship between the variable and the load demand. The third item, we must research these time variables. We want to ideally have an appreciation of, have these variables been influencing the market for quite a while? The only way to do that is to take that data. And you need data for at least 10, 20 years back if you're looking to forecast at least 10 years into the future. There's no guarantee, of course, that the accuracy of your data will reflect changes within the most recent time, as well as changes that may come, which is to the point that we were discussing before. You have to update on a regular basis. Having a model is one thing. Having an updated model that is constantly being updated ensures the accuracy towards having a model that can give you some measure of confidence that you can mitigate that risk. So having defined what will be the time series of these variables, you have to do a little bit of regression analysis, because you really want to determine, is this making sense? Is there a linkage here? Statistically, is it going to influence my load? Is this variable going to influence my load? And then, of course, you test and you validate your model. You determine your errors utilizing historical data, and you plot some forecasts. And that is the equivalent of how you would achieve model development in 5 steps, but it is not so easy. This explains the process. If I were to take customer such as the domestic and residential, and I've just did one example here for you, we know that energy is influenced by a host of variables, and I've listed them. Personal disposable income, the price of electricity, the number of customers, inflation, people per household, air conditioning, appliance prices, the fuel price, technology. And by that, it depends on it's linked to your appliance. It depends on what type of equipment you have in your home. And we are looking here at energy sales. So if I want to determine what my energy sales are going to be, these are the types of variables that I would look at. Now, guess what? The disposable income and the price of electricity can also be time lag. So if I were to produce a model based on a single family that lives in a duplex apartment, a building, a townhouse, what we have is a multifactorial approach. And this equation that you see on the screen, though quite long, gives me an appreciation that here's what? The customer elasticity, which is C, the number of customers, has the highest positive coefficient at 1.72. Then I look at P. P is the price of electricity, also time lag by T minus 1. A negative coefficient that is less than 1, suggesting that it's least sensitive. And because it's least sensitive, we actually know that the variable that will give me the most influence into my energy sales in this case is the customer elasticity. Personal disposable income, PDI, is positive and at 0.363. So that suggests to me that there's some measure of affordability. So it is actually tying very closely into what you see in society and what's happening in society. But that's how we can use this model for sales for this type of customer. Now just imagine that every time you do this, you are going to do this model for a different type of customer. You're going to do it for a different objective, and therefore you can end up with many different models for many different categories of customers. So what I have on this graph, this figure, sorry, is an appreciation for us that we want to get these social and behavioral inputs. We can, but we require surveys. We require surveys that are accurate, surveys that have been validated, surveys that have a good reliability. If we take that, we couple it with the end use forecast, which would be the economic activity, look at the technological side of things, what you can potentially come up with is a useful energy demand. And why is this important? Well, this gives us an appreciation of how each one of these three variables will impact the energy consumption, whether it be on a personal level, a household level, a domestic level, a commercial level. We can now use that to inform the appliance usage, because ultimately what you have here is the final energy demand will be influenced by your energy appliance as well as your energy from the secondary sources. So let's assume here that you came up with this energy profile, and then customers decide that they're going to buy certain types of equipment, and whether they're utilizing anything from a smart washing machine to a smart microwave that does some level of control and can give them an appreciation that I can do my washing at a period of low peak. What that allows me to do is to have a revised final energy demand. And therefore, if there's renewable energy that you're bringing into the system with storage, you could potentially have an opportunity to marry the efficiency and the flexibility of end-use appliances with the secondary energy mix to capture what would be a revised, updated, and perhaps versatile final energy demand. So let me step a little further into the end-use model. The end-use model, we have energy consumption levels by end use, and they are adjusted to agree with the customer, because you have data and aggregate weather information. We could have cooling data, we could have other types of variables. These variables account for saturation levels. And what do we mean by this? Essentially, there's a finite point to which we will be utilizing our cooling. And that is determined by the size of the home, the income, your household size, the price, the efficiency of the units. What we also have are the other variables. The other variables can also play a role here. These other variables also play a part of the demand side activity, which is something that we're going to discuss on next week. But the key thing about this slide is that when you have demand side utility oriented schemes, it helps create a different end use model so that it influences how you use cooling. It also influences how you use other facilities in your home. So what you end up with is a very good cycle where the utility has implemented programs in the past, and you can use these programs to track sales, track history, and therefore, guess what? Come up with what would be an improved demand side projection. So this is the end use model. We have just discussed the econometric model. This is the end use model. They all in very much provide you with the end result as tracking load with these variables. We need data. The data requirements are a little different because in the econometric model, we are looking about finances. We are looking about the elasticity associated with our customers, the electricity price. What we really want to do here is focus a little bit on the financial part. And in the end user model, we look a little bit on the technology. We do focus on finance, but what you're looking at is how the users have been utilizing the energy. Improper data selection and poor data analysis will lead to low accuracy, which means, like everything else when we discuss any grid modeling, if you do not have a sufficient resolution of data, a sufficient horizon of data, you are going to end up with challenges in your models because they may not be a true reflection of what has happened and therefore what can happen. So bringing this demand side management influence, this graph from the ITRON white paper I thought was very useful. And it gives us an appreciation how demand side management actually influences our demand side projection, which is quite useful to note because this is where your distribution level equipment can do some measure of logging and automatically plot and track these patterns for you. So let's look at the historical bit. The historical period identifies that before demand side management, you have this part. And at the onset of demand side management, and so this would be the equivalent of here, you now have a change in your load part. This measured load is significantly less than the dotted red line, which looks at the load plus the demand side past contribution. So this is without. This is what it would have been predicted to be. Then we get to a point where we want to forecast into the future. That's the blue line. So look at something here. We have a projection on the blue dotted line that showcases the forecast without demand side management. And then of course, we have a forecast without future demand side management and with demand side management. And what you're actually catching up on here is the fact that with the demand side management, the gradient is not as steep. And therefore, what you can identify is the demand side influence has a measure of accounting for the historical pattern that can influence your future. End result is you have managed to reduce your load, which is quite useful. There was a question that came up about commercially available applications. Well, we have some of those here. So I've provided some links for you all. I know that these slides will be shared so that you can have a look at them. A lot of these commercially available applications, they all have the same fundamental process that we just described in terms of the model development, whether you use an end user model, whether you use an econometric model, whether you are going to look at a piecewise versus a polynomial, the fundamental concept remains the same. So next I want to touch on some demand forecasting techniques, and this is going to carry us a little bit into understanding how you will actually implement these steps. So we go in a little deeper. So the first bit is we have to determine the use of the forecast, and we've been discussing that earlier on, how we intend to use the forecast, who is using the forecast. The next is to select the items that we want to forecast. We look at the horizon of the forecast. We have to determine the models, we have to gather the data, and then we have to make the forecast, and then validate and implement the results. Very similar to what we would have discussed in the circular diagram that I shared before. So there are many methods. Well, guess what? How do you know which one to choose? Right. Well, there are three basic types. You have qualitative techniques, time series analysis and projection, and causal models. The first uses the qualitative data, and this is the expert opinion, for example, and information about special events that we have already mentioned and may or may not take past into consideration. The second, on the other hand, it focuses entirely on pattern and pattern changes, and thus relies entirely on historical data. The third uses highly redefined and specific information about relationships. So therefore you're looking at between the system elements, and is very powerful to take into consideration the special events that we discussed. Now there are two types of quantitative forecasting methods which are seen on the screen here. We have the time series model, and you can see where this arrow here from time series goes into seasonal, cyclical, and then gets onto the trends. They examine the past data patterns and forecast the future on the basis of the underlying patterns that are obtained from that historical data. You have many different types of time series, whether it be simple and weighted moving averages, seasonal indices, trend projections, simple mean, and exponential smoothing. So you have those techniques that can help you. And all that's captured here on the moving averages. The next would be the associative models, also known as the causal models. This model assumes that the variable that is being forecast is associated with other variables, just like we did before with the temperature analysis. The linear regression is one of the simplest forms. That doesn't mean that it's the only form that can be utilized. It all depends on the nature of the relationship between the variable and the load. And that's what we just discussed with the temperature having a non-linear relationship. The quantitative modeling, forecasting methods are very easy to predict based on the underlying information. That's seen in this far left corner of the screen. This data can be used to forecast automatically without many complications, and a person can easily forecast based on the available data. Now, that also means that if you're looking at the data and you're relying solely on the quantitative side, you are potentially going to rely heavily on the data, and the entire forecasting depends on the data and the underlying model. An error in the data can lead to something going horribly wrong, and this is what you want to avoid. So that's another issue that we have to consider in terms of data. Let me give you some snapshots of what these graphs could possibly look like. A seasonal pattern exists when a series is influenced by a season. And of course, that could be anything from quarter, it could be a day of the week, it could be a month. A cyclical pattern exists when the data exhibits a rise and fall that is not correlated to a definition of time. So in other words, it happens independently. Now, these fluctuations could be long-term, we have no idea. But what you're looking for is the flow, that pattern. What I wanted to do is just take you on a journey into the calculation bit, so you'll have an idea of how it actually works. So this is a very simple example for us. That should give us a better appreciation. If you're a manager of a shop and you're selling preserved fruits, something that we can all relate to if you're in a parlor, you wish to forecast the sales of red mango for 2009 using a 3-year moving average. So we identify since 2004 to 2008, these are the number of cases, 6, 4, 5, 7, 9. So what's going to happen in 2009? Well, if I am utilizing a moving average, what I can look at is I look at the last 3 years and I say, okay, I look back at my data and I said, okay, 6 plus 4 plus 5 is 15. Therefore, 15 would have been what my estimate should have been in 2007. 15 over 3, because it's 3 years, I get 5. All right. And then I go one step further and say, if I'm utilizing this data, and I now have 4, 5, and 7, because I've sold 7, whereas I predicted 5. I got a total of 16, but instead I actually sold 9. My moving average would have been 16 divided by the 3, which is 5.33. So what you see there is this moving average method gave you a number. You're heavily reliant on the mathematics without having an appreciation of what is actually happening. There may have been some other variable influencing the sales of red mango. What about if I were to look at this as a plot? Well, this is what it looks like. The actual and the moving average forecast. This is one example of how you can apply this technique to get an appreciation of the curves. What is the disadvantage of this example? Well, increasing N makes the forecast less sensitive to changes. You do not forecast trend well due to a delay between the actual outcome and the forecast. It's difficult to trace any seasonal patterns. You don't know what's happening. And of course, you require historical data. You can look at a weighted moving average. So let's go back to that same example and look at exponential smoothing. And in this case, I decided to use an exponential smoothing coefficient of 0.4. Alpha is 0.4. In this particular example, when I've applied the simple maths to it, where I've multiplied my coefficient, and you multiply the coefficient, what you actually get is 3 curves here now instead, where I have a single exponential smoothing waveform, which is my yellow graph. And what I am seeing is, look at that relative to my moving average. It begins to take a little more shape. So what you see is, as you begin to include a little more complexity into your modeling to take care of some of these challenges, what you end up with is a graph that looks a little more like what actually happened. And in this case, we just put weighting onto the last variable, and that was quite useful, and that helped us. If we were to talk about the growth rate, we saw a graph earlier with the compound annual growth rate. Well, guess what? This plays a particular role in influencing our load. And yes, you have the energy that is documented historically. So you have that data, and you can use that now to influence what your projected demand will be. And it's a variable of time. You can utilize this growth rate. However, getting to that point where you get that growth rate, there's a lot more that we have to discuss to get to that point. And that also influences the accuracy of your projected demand. Elasticity. So in a nutshell, the elasticity gives you a measure of the flexibility of your system. And we have extremes. Elasticity takes care of the change in the energy with respect to the change in GDP. So in other words, that change that you're looking for is a ratio of the changes. And you want to determine where that correlation exists. Because if there's a change in the GDP, how directly proportional or indirectly proportional is that change in that consumption going to be? Gives you a measure of how flexible your system is to a change in the GDP of the nation. Some models here, and this is perhaps going a little detail that you may encounter at some point in time, or perhaps you may read about it. It is difficult to identify which one is the most accurate, first to begin. The success of the model depends on the criteria. I have provided a list here of models with some pros and cons. It all involves data processing, which means you need good data. You need to analyze this data. The model parameters and the choice really hinge on your ability to recognize how your data relates to your system, because what you want is that expertise that the model, or I should say that expertise that your group brings to the table in terms of identifying the suitability of the model to this data. And of course, you can try different permutation and combinations until you identify which gives you the best fit, because you also have regression that we just discussed that can give you a measure of that matching, that correlation. So it's quite useful, but again, it carries you into a realm where you need to have a good appreciation that you need to do it first, and then you can improve subsequently on the iterations, but you need to start somewhere. So I'm sure this is a question that many people may have, and truth is, it's difficult. It really depends on how expert your resources are, how much expertise exists, because you can take a time series analysis and expert system on artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence techniques have been known to give you a mean absolute percentage error of less than 5%, but you need to have a model to ensure that the artificial intelligence can work with. So there's a lot of, you cannot work without having an appreciation of what that data represents and how accurate that data is, so that when you get these relationships, you ensure that your final method, whatever it is you choose, will have accurate data. Okay. So that brings us up now to the closing remarks, and this is quite interesting here. Some facts in forecasting. The main assumption is that the past pattern repeats itself into the future. Yes, that's the main assumption. But we all know that life happens and that can change. So we need to be preparing ourselves to ensure that we can, as best as possible, control what we can control, which means that forecasts are really perfect. So don't expect your forecast to be exactly equal to the actual data. It is perhaps never going to be, because your forecast, depending on whatever time horizon you look at, will not be able to cater for the unexpected. We are looking to minimize the risk. The art and science of forecasting to minimize and eliminate the errors. And of course, that's the difference between the actual and the measured. No forecasting method is effective in all situations. And we discussed that earlier, because ultimately what you have different methods for different applications, for different time horizons, for different data. You need good judgment. You need to exercise some measure of intuition, commercial knowledge and experience to making a forecasting method effective. But the thing is, you need to start somewhere. So you start with the most simplest method that you can, and each iteration you'll be able to reduce that error by applying modifications to your models. And that is critical. It helps you identify if the challenge is going to be on your data or on your model. And as you proceed, you actually get more data, and that data will help inform the entire process. So starting is critical. Some general takeaways: we need load forecasting for survival, financial survival, and utilities must plan. We have the ever-changing risk of environmental regulation, aging assets, infrastructure, the cost of hydrocarbons, renewables, new appliances, and of course, new technology. But as much as possible, An accurate load forecast for resource planning is desired, and therefore designing the rates and the structures and the financial planning would be a part of the process. So if we look at it, the load forecasts are critical. We need to have as much accurate load forecasts as possible moving forward, which means that our data needs to be accurate. We have new smart grid technologies coming into play, which means we're getting big data. Big data is a happy problem, but also a big problem if you don't use the data wisely. It means that you're sitting now on a reservoir of information that can help you optimize your system technically and financially. And that is something that we need to be able to harness. Integration of smart grid technologies into legacy systems create a challenge for extraction of data, processing of the data. And then of course, that, if not utilized effectively, means that you introduce your own errors, but you have the assets and the resources, which is that data and the equipment collecting that data, not being utilized effectively. And of course, our errors exist. The errors exist. We need to find a way to reduce those errors. The errors could be anything from data sources, the information that has not been provided, not been considered, usually about the loads, and of course the forecast that yields higher than physical limits of the end use, which means practically we may have a challenge there. We need to be able to identify that. This last slide here, I think, is quite interesting because it gives us a historical context of the drivers, the data sources, and the framework. It shows how we have evolved, how generation capacity planning has evolved, and we are now moving towards future grid management, how we look at climate change, how we look at large-scale distributed energy resource integration, how we're going to utilize the data. Before we only had monthly bills. Now we have data on demand. How do you utilize this data to improve performance at all levels? And therefore, we go from what would have been annual consumption to very granular location and from a time base as short as we could possibly get based on the limitations of our recording instruments. And at distribution level, you can get feeder information down to minutes. Depending on what limitations that you have, we are going to overcome those at some point in time. And integration with a particular type of framework, that model framework, which may be linked to your vendor, maybe linking the software application, and maybe providing you with an analysis, and you end up with turnkey packages that can give the planning and the planning department of a utility, the policy makers, and even the equipment manufacturers and suppliers a better appreciation of what that demand is going to look like. So Sherry and I will end there. That part, I hope everyone was able to grasp that we were looking a little more on the technical side and perhaps focusing a little bit on the numerical side to give you all just an appreciation of what it means as you go deeper into demand side projection.
Thank you very much, Sanjay. We have a few questions. So the first one, and this is related to the formula that you use with the weighted temperatures.
Yeah.
The weights to be used in the formula, is that taken from the results of a regression analysis? How do you come up with those weightings?
So those weights would be part of the regression analysis, and they would also form you have to look at the correlation with the load as well, because there's a time lag involved. So you will have to factor in both the regression analysis with respect to the load and the time lag. So yes, and there are other mathematical tools that can help you come up with the weighting, particularly if you're utilizing a multivariable approach. So it depends on which variable that you know to have a more influential role in the load consumption.
Okay, all right, thank you. Another one here, the disposable income, we see a positive correlation there, but how likely is it that with energy efficiency, sustainability, that we could have an energy system where demand actually goes down with an increase in disposable income.
All right, well, let's show this one to Professor Sharma. He's eager to answer this one.
All right, Prof.
With the advent of new technology, what you'll find is that annually, the consumption of electricity to produce the same type of output is decreasing because efficiencies are going up higher and higher and higher. So if you integrate that over a complete system, you can find that although you have disposable income going up, you can find household consumption dropping. And you can see that very easily if someone just change all their bulbs to LEDs. You find that drops immediately. And then if you change all your other equipment in the house, right? For instance, your refrigerators, your washing machine to energy efficient machine or energy saving, it's going to drop. So you can see it happening, but what would happen in a case like that, it will finally pick up with you, because what may happen is that if you have electric vehicles coming into play, then you may find that the electric vehicle might not compensate for the reduction that they had in the house, right? So you can get it, but it depends on all the factors playing. But one of the common factors that is true to everything is that energy efficiency, whether it's electricity or it's gasoline or it's natural gas, it's going up. It's going up, and therefore the quantum you need for the same amount of work is going down.
Okay, all right, thanks, Prof. And as you mentioned electric vehicles, I have a question on whether or not you could see within the Caribbean a system where the electric vehicles don't just operate on the demand side, but they are become more integrated into the energy system. We've seen persons put forward suggestions that you could have EVs where they could help with shocks, like when you have your cloud cover, you could have the EVs plugged in throughout the day, and you could switch to them to pull power from them during the day. How likely do you see that happening in the region?
So it can happen. I mean, essentially, a EV is a battery on wheels, and that's good and bad. Well, I shouldn't say bad. It's good, and it has its challenges, and we need to ensure that we can mitigate the challenges of having these batteries connected at all different points in the network. So yes, it can happen within the region. We need to ensure that from a grid perspective, we are at that point where we can handle the integration at strategic points, because it's not going to be a simple case of ensuring that each vehicle, wherever they're plugged in, just provides this flow. It's going to be, there needs to be some measure of protection, some measure of coordination, and to ensure that the grid maintains the stability associated with these small but numerous contributions onto the grid. So it can happen, but all in due course.
Let me add on to that. One of the things that a lot of people miss in EV integration, because EV, as Sanjay said, is a battery on wheel, is that there are many other things that must come into play before it can happen. One of them is that you need an inverter at home to put it onto the grid. Two, you need some resident reactive power at that location. Three, you need metering, which is going to be different to what we have right now. And four, you need a coordinating agency to ensure that what is happening there is coordinated, and that you can have the case where it happens willy-nilly and you actually interfere with the operation of the grid and reliability of the grid also. So there are a lot of things that need to happen. They are not technically impossible, but it needs planning, and it's going to cost you.
All right, thank you very much, Prof. Thank you, Sanjay. That's it for the questions, and that is why we are championing integrated resource and resilience planning, so we can look at what is happening, what is possible, what is likely, so that our energy systems can indeed be more resilient. So before you go, Just a few reminders. Next week, we have a follow-up to today's session. We'll be looking at demand side management. So we invite you, if you have not yet registered, to register for next week's session. You can go to CCREEE.org/events to get more information on everything that we have coming up. Thank you, Prof. Sharma. Thank you, Sanjay, for leading us so ably through the content. Thanks to the CCREEE team who continue to ensure the quality of our capacity building sessions. And thank you, our participants, for participating in today's session on basic demand projections. Before you go, we invite you to share your feedback with us in the survey that will come up at the end of the session. And we encourage you to continue to keep the people of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, St. Lucia and Barbados in your thoughts, and to do your part to help them recover from this volcanic event. Have a productive rest of your day.